July 5, 2025, at approximately 3:45 p.m., Southwest Area Gang Enforcement Detail officers were conducting routine patrol along the Western Avenue corridor near Martin Luther King, MLK Park in Los Angeles, California. This area was familiar to the officers due to recurring gang-related activity, and their patrol presence was focused on maintaining visibility and addressing potential criminal behavior. As the officers moved along Western Avenue, they observed a man riding a bicycle northbound on the sidewalk, which caught their attention. The individual was later identified as 26-year-old Ernesto Sepulveda, a resident with suspected gang ties. As officers continued to monitor him, they noticed behavior and body movements that caused them to believe he was in possession of a handgun. Based on their observations, they initiated a pedestrian stop on the 3900 block of Southwestern Avenue. Their intent was to safely detain Sepulveda, investigate the suspected firearm, and determine whether he was armed and in violation of any laws. As the officers approached, Sepulveda initially stopped. However, before the officers could complete their investigation, Sepulveda abruptly fled on foot. The sudden flight immediately transformed the situation from a routine investigative stop into an active pursuit. Officers initiated a chase, moving south along Western Avenue as Sepulveda attempted to create distance. During the foot pursuit, Sepulveda reached into his waistband and produced a pistol. This confirmed the officers' suspicion and elevated the danger significantly. The environment quickly shifted as Sepulveda turned and fired at the pursuing officers. In the exchange, one officer was struck in the legs by gunfire. The injury forced the officer out of the initial pursuit, while additional units responded to maintain containment. Despite having fired at officers, Sepulveda continued running south on Western Avenue. Backup officers arriving on scene were met with another gunshot as Sepulveda fired an additional round while fleeing. At this point, the encounter had escalated into an armed confrontation involving multiple officers and an actively shooting suspect. The unfolding situation placed both responding officers and the surrounding community at substantial risk. What had begun as a bicycle stop had now become an officer-involved shooting, OIS, involving a 26-year-old armed suspect determined to evade arrest at any cost. After firing multiple rounds at officers, Ernesto Sepulveda continued traveling south on Western Avenue. As additional backup units approached the area, Sepulveda's behavior became increasingly desperate. While in motion, he attempted to fire again, but his handgun experienced a malfunction. This mechanical failure temporarily disabled the weapon and prevented him from firing further. Realizing the firearm was no longer operable, Sepulveda discarded it onto the ground and continued running. The malfunction and discarded weapon were pivotal moments in the pursuit. Without a functioning handgun, Sepulveda no longer had the ability to fire additional rounds, but officers still had to consider him a significant threat due to his willingness to use deadly force moments earlier. Responding officers continued chasing him southbound while broadcasting updates about his direction of travel and the discarded firearm. Sepulveda fled into the open grounds of Martin Luther King, MLK Park. This shift from a street environment to a public park created a new set of challenges. Officers had to move quickly to prevent Sepulveda from disappearing into the park or approaching families and individuals using the recreation areas. Given the earlier gunfire, safety remained the highest priority. Inside MLK Park, officers continued to close distance. When they reached Sepulveda, a non-categorical use of force, NCUOF, occurred during the takedown. Sepulveda resisted attempts to bring him into custody, requiring officers to physically subdue him in accordance with department procedures for a violently resisting suspect. Moments later, officers were able to restrain him and place him in handcuffs. With Sepulveda secured, officers shifted focus to the injured officer from the earlier exchange. The officer had sustained gunshot wounds to both legs and suffered a graze wound to the cheek. Emergency medical personnel transported him to a nearby hospital where he received treatment and was listed in stable condition. Despite the seriousness of his injuries, he survived the incident. Sepulveda also sustained a laceration to his head during the takedown in MLK Park. He was transported to a local hospital, treated by medical staff, and medically cleared for booking. No other officers or community members were injured throughout the encounter. The black steel 9mm polymer 80 ghost gun, the loaded magazine, and the discharged cartridge cases from Sepulveda's weapon were recovered at the scene and booked as evidence. Once Ernesto Sepulveda was taken into custody, officers ensured he received immediate medical attention for the head laceration sustained during the physical takedown inside MLK Park. Medical personnel evaluated him at a local hospital where he was treated and officially cleared for booking. His injuries were non-life-threatening, and doctors determined he was stable enough to be transferred into police custody. Simultaneously, investigators and evidence technicians began processing the multiple scenes connected to the incident. The first area examined was the stretch of Western Avenue where Sepulveda fired on the gang enforcement detail officers. They marked the positions of discharged cartridge cases and documented the area where the injured officer had been struck. The shell casings were collected, photographed, and stored for ballistic comparison. Farther down Western Avenue, investigators located the spot where Sepulveda had fired at backup officers. Witness statements, body-worn camera footage, and physical evidence helped reconstruct the rapid movement that occurred during the pursuit. Officers also identified and recovered the firearm Sepulveda discarded after the malfunction. It was confirmed to be a black steel 9mm polymer 80 ghost gun, a type of weapon known for lacking serial numbers and often assembled from unfinished components. The pistol's slide-locked position supported the fact that the weapon had malfunctioned during the encounter. Inside MLK Park, investigators documented the final takedown location and the circumstances surrounding the non-categorical use of force required to subdue Sepulveda. Officers provided recorded statements explaining the events, the pursuit, Sepulveda's gunfire, and the moment they were able to safely bring him into custody. Meanwhile, doctors continued monitoring the officer who had been shot. He remained hospitalized in stable condition, receiving treatment for gunshot wounds to both legs and a graze wound to the cheek. His condition was closely followed by the department due to the severity of the injuries sustained in the line of duty. Sepulveda, having been medically cleared, was formally booked. The charges reflected the multiple rounds he fired at officers, his attempts to escape, and the weapon recovered at the scene. The lack of injuries to the public was considered a fortunate outcome, given the suspect's armed resistance and the busy environment near MLK Park. By the conclusion of the investigation, the recovered ghost gun, the cartridge cases, and the officer's body-worn camera footage collectively established a clear and consistent timeline of the incident. The physical evidence confirmed that Sepulveda fled immediately after officers initiated a lawful pedestrian stop and, during his attempt to escape, produced a firearm and opened fire at the pursuing officers. The collected ballistic evidence matched the locations where shots were fired, supporting the finding that one officer was struck in the legs during the initial exchange. Footage and witness statements further verified that Sepulveda continued running while firing an additional round at responding backup officers before his weapon malfunctioned. Once the malfunction occurred, he discarded the firearm and ran into MLK Park, where officers eventually subdued him. The thorough and coordinated response by Southwest area personnel, both those involved in the pursuit and those providing perimeter support, effectively contained the threat, prevented any additional injuries to officers or community members, and ensured that Sepulveda was ultimately taken into custody safely and in accordance with department procedures.